I've spent most of my life believing that the world is built on a foundation of unspoken agreements. That if you work hard, play by the rules, and treat your corner of the earth with a certain degree of reverence, the universe will, in turn, leave you to your own devices, and after a decade of surviving the high-stakes, soul-crushing grind of the Chicago corporate legal circuit followed by a divorce that felt more like an amputation than a legal separation, I decided to test that theory in the humid, salt-stained outskirts of Florida. I bought a house in Whispering Palms Estates, a place where the air tastes like brine and the palm fronds whisper secrets to the wind, trading my skyline view for a private dock on a canal that leads directly into the emerald embrace of the Gulf. Thinking that for the first time in 40 years, I could finally hear myself think without the constant background static of someone else's expectations. There is a specific kind of tranquility found in the early hours of a Florida morning, a moment when the mist is still clinging to the surface of the canal like a translucent shroud, and the sun is just a suggestion of gold behind the mangroves. And it was in this stillness that I walked out onto my back deck, a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand, ready to perform my daily ritual of checking the lines on my 24-foot Maverick Master Angler, a vessel that was less a boat to me and more a floating symbol of my regained autonomy. I reached the edge of the wooden pier, my eyes searching for the familiar, sleek white silhouette of the hull, the way it usually sat low and confident in the water. But as the mist began to swirl and dissipate, my heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it had been physically seized by a cold, invisible hand. The boat was gone, not drifting, not listing, not stolen by some amateur joyrider who had cut the ropes in a hurry, because the heavy-duty marine-grade lines were missing entirely, and the stainless steel cleats on my dock were as bare as a bone in the desert, with no scuff marks, no signs of a struggle, and no oily residue left behind by a fleeing engine. It was as if the water had simply opened up and swallowed $80,000 of my life without leaving a single ripple, and as I stood there in the oppressive silence, the coffee in my hand going cold as the reality of the void began to sink in, I felt a premonition that this wasn't an act of God or a crime of opportunity, but a calculated, clinical strike from a shadow that had been watching me since the day I moved in. I didn't know then that this was a declaration of war, and the person who had pulled the trigger was a woman who saw my dock not as a piece of my property, but as a square on her personal chessboard. Her name was Victoria Thorne, the president of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, CCHA, a woman who carried herself with the terrifying, unshakable confidence of someone who believes that a set of neighborhood bylaws is the supreme law of the land, and that she was its only ordained prophet. When the Pine County Sheriff's Department finally sent a deputy out 2 hours later, a man named Miller, who looked like he had spent 20 years inhaling the exhaust fumes of small-town indifference. He didn't even step off his motorcycle. He just looked at my empty boat slip, adjusted his sunglasses, and told me with a flat, bureaucratic drone that there were no signs of forced entry, and therefore, under the current jurisdictional guidelines, this was a civil dispute rather than a criminal theft. My blood began to simmer, a slow heat rising from my chest to my throat as I tried to explain that boats don't just evaporate. But before I could finish my sentence, a silver golf cart hummed quietly onto my driveway, and out stepped Victoria Thorne, looking as if she had been plucked from a high-end country club catalog, flanked by a man named Rodriguez, a former security guard with a permanent scowl who functioned as her personal enforcer and the CCHA's compliance director. "It's no use bothering the deputy, Mr. Harrison," Victoria said, her voice a sharp, polished weapon that cut through the humid air with a terrifying precision, as she held up a laminated document that was covered in fine print and official-looking stamps. "The CCHA has exercised its right of non-judicial seizure under Bylaw 7.4, aesthetic preservation, due to your repeated and willful failure to address the distressing discoloration on your boat's canopy, which we have deemed a blight on the communal waterways of Whispering Palms, and since you ignored the 3 certified violation notices we sent, notices I knew were never delivered because my mailbox had been empty for weeks, your vessel is now being held in a secure, third-party facility until all fines, impound fees, and administrative penalties are paid in full, a total that currently sits at $11,000. I looked at her, then at the deputy who was already turning his engine back on, and I realized with a sickening clarity that in this town, the HOA wasn't a neighborhood committee. It was a sovereign state, and I was a citizen who had just had his rights stripped away by a woman who enjoyed the process far more than the result. The week that followed was a descent into a specific Kafkaesque nightmare, where the rules changed whenever I got close to understanding them, and the more I tried to fight the system through traditional channels, the more the system seemed to tighten around my neck like a velvet noose. I spent my afternoons pacing my living room, the space feeling smaller and more fragile with every passing hour, and my nights were spent in the flickering light of a laptop screen, digging into the history of the Cypress Creek HOA, trying to find a crack in Victoria Thorne's armor. What I discovered was a landscape of fear that extended far beyond my own dock. I found Mr. Sterling, a retired schoolteacher 3 streets over who had lost his family's heirloom 1964 Lincoln Continental because it was parked on unauthorized gravel, and Mrs. Gable, a widow whose bank account had been frozen by an HO-initiated lien because her mailbox was the wrong shade of beige number 4. Victoria wasn't just enforcing rules. She was running an extractive empire, using a network of shell companies and preferred vendors like Rodriguez's towing and storage business to siphon the life savings out of the residents of Whispering Palms, creating a cycle of debt and forfeiture that allowed her to effectively own the neighborhood without ever having to buy it. I realized that if I went to court now, Victoria would win because she had the paperwork, she had the board, and she had the local civil designation that acted as a shield against police intervention. So I decided to do the one thing a narcissist like her never expects. I stopped reacting. I didn't call her office, I didn't send angry emails, and I didn't try to bribe Rodriguez to tell me where my boat was. Instead, I became a ghost in my own community, a man who sat on his porch with a pair of binoculars and a notebook, documenting every move Victoria made, every golf cart meeting she had under the cover of the Oaks, and every official document that was posted on a neighbor's door. In the silence of my observation, the truth began to reveal itself in the small, neglected details. The way Victoria always met with a certain representative from a high-end yacht brokerage at the Cypress Point Yacht Club on Tuesday nights, and the way the CCHA's annual financial audit was performed by a firm that shared the same P.O. box as Rodriguez's storage facility. I wasn't looking at a neighborhood association anymore. I was looking at a racketeering enterprise that used aesthetic standards as a smokescreen for high-value asset theft and money laundering. And as the tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch, with more and more violation stickers appearing on luxury cars and boats like yellow fever marks, I knew I had to find a higher power than a local judge. The twist came on a Tuesday, during a storm that turned the Florida sky into a bruised shade of purple, when a misplaced piece of mail, a tax document from the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, addressed to an entity called Thornrod Asset Acquisitions, was delivered to my house by mistake. I opened it, my hands trembling not from cold, but from the sheer adrenaline of discovery, and I saw a ledger of liquidated assets that included cars, boats, and even a small aircraft, all seized from various HOAs across the state over the last 5 years and sold through a private auction house owned by Victoria's brother. I didn't take this to the local cops. I took it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, field office in Tampa, presenting them not with a complaint about a stolen boat, but with a roadmap of a multi-county fraud ring that was using the lack of HOA oversight in Florida to run a modern-day pirate operation. They had been looking for a way into Victoria Thorne's world for a long time, but they needed a hook, someone on the inside who was willing to let the HOA take everything so that the feds could watch where it went, and I told the lead agent, a woman named Special Agent Vance who had eyes as cold as a deep-sea trench, that I was willing to be the bait. I went back to Whispering Palms and did nothing when Victoria sent me a final notice of permanent foreclosure on my boat. I did nothing when she bragged to the neighbors at the pool about how she was cleaning up the trash in the estates, and I did nothing when Rodriguez spit on my driveway every morning. I was the silent observer, the man who was letting his world burn so that he could catch the person holding the match. The climax didn't happen in the sterile light of a boardroom. It happened under the suffocating, humid darkness of a Friday night during the Cypress Creek HOA Annual Gala of Standards, an event where the elite of the neighborhood gathered to celebrate their exclusivity while the people they had robbed stayed hidden in their homes. I didn't attend the party, but I was there in the shadows of the marina, standing on the very edge of the water where my dock met the canal, waiting for the signal that would finally break the silence of the last 3 months. At exactly 11 p.m., the quiet was shattered by a sound that made every head in the gala turn toward the water. A deep, resonant, and undeniably powerful blast of an air horn, the specific, custom-tuned 3-tone chime on my Maverick Master Angler, echoing off the multimillion-dollar houses like a scream of defiance. Suddenly, the canal was flooded with light, but it wasn't the soft glow of landscape lanterns. It was the harsh, flickering, and absolute blue-and-red strobes of 4 FBI interceptor boats and a U.S. Coast Guard cutter that roared around the bend of the mangroves, their engines churning the water into a white, chaotic froth. Victoria Thorne came running out onto the clubhouse pier, her designer dress clutched in her hands, her face a mask of panicked confusion as she screamed at Rodriguez to make them stop. But the man who had spent months bullying senior citizens was currently face down on the dock, his hands zip-tied behind his back by agents who had emerged from the shadows of the very boat slips the HOA had stolen. It was a cinematic symphony of justice, as the gala guests looked on in stunned silence. Special Agent Vance stepped off the lead boat, a stack of federal warrants in her hand, and walked directly up to Victoria Thorne, who was now backed against a railing, her authority evaporating with every flash of the police lights. The charges weren't just for a boat. They were for wire fraud, extortion, interstate transportation of stolen property, and a laundry list of RICO violations that would ensure Victoria would be trading her silk robes for a subsidized orange jumpsuit for the next 20 years of her life. I walked out from the shadows then, stepping onto the pier as they led her away in handcuffs. And for the first time since I moved to Florida, the air felt clear, as if the corruption that had been clogging the atmosphere had finally been scrubbed away by the tide. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic kind of rage, the look of a predator who had finally realized she was in a cage, and I didn't say a word. I just watched as they loaded her onto the back of a transport vehicle, the queen of whispering palms, reduced to just another file in a federal database. By the time the sun came up the next morning, my boat was back in its slip, the line secured by the very agents who had recovered it from a hidden warehouse in the Everglades, and the high priestess was being processed in a federal holding cell in Tampa. The Cypress Creek HOA was immediately placed under a court-ordered receivership. The board was dissolved, and every single fine and lien that had been issued under Victoria's reign was declared null and void, returning millions of dollars in equity back to the families she had terrorized. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. The violation stickers disappeared, replaced by the sound of children playing and neighbors actually speaking to one another across fences that were no longer weapons of war. And as I sat on my dock that evening, the Maverick bobbing gently against the pilings, I realized that the tranquility I had been looking for wasn't something you could buy. It was something you had to earn by refusing to blink when the darkness looked your way. I still live in whispering palms, and I still drink my coffee on the dock every morning, watching the sunrise hit the water, but I never take the silence for granted anymore, because I know now that the price of peace is a constant, quiet vigilance against those who would try to turn your sanctuary into their kingdom. We voluntarily enter into these contracts for the sake of order and value. But at what point does a private association become a threat to the fundamental rights of a citizen? Should there be a federal bill of rights specifically for homeowners to prevent the kind of non-judicial seizure seen here? For years, the residents of this neighborhood watched their neighbors lose their cars, their savings, and their dignity. Yet no one spoke up until a LULU-style observer arrived. Is the modern suburban dream making us too isolated to stand up for our community, or are we just too afraid of the Karen with the gavel? In this story, the protagonist didn't win by fighting fire with fire. He won by staying still and letting the enemy expose themselves. In a world that demands instant reaction and loud outrage, is observation and silence the most powerful weapon we have left against corruption? If you woke up tomorrow and your most prized possession was gone, taken by someone hiding behind a rule, would you scream at the wind, or would you wait in the shadows until the truth set you free? Let me know in the comments.